Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about code evaluation. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, Frederick, how do you evaluate somebody's code? This is a great question. So it depends on who I'm going to evaluate a little bit. So I can tell you sort of how I do it when I do code reviews for code tests and stuff like that for companies. So first and foremost, I just care about what type of role are we looking for. So if we have a test that is supposed to be for a certain type of profile, I will make a certain set of considerations. If I am there's just anybody who's going to get hired here. Like we were going to hire everything from juniors up to seniors. It doesn't really matter, and the test is sort of the same thing. I will think about things in a different way. So the way that I do it is actually very simple. I need to feel comfortable in that I understand how the common pattern of doing things is done in that specific type of language. And that basically means that depending on the code test, if it's like just a very simple algorithmic thing, it's usually a little bit easy, or like you can't derive as much from it, but you can do you can make some thoughts and assumptions about certain things. But if it's like a more realistic code test, the ones where you actually build a small application or something like that, it's usually easier because there's usually a set of tools around it, and they might add libraries or things like that. And that's where my experience in different languages and different communities is very useful, because I can very quickly see if they're using the same sort of patterns that I expect most people to use when they're dealing with a certain stack. So an example would be if I'm evaluating a Java project, well then I'm going to take a look at have they followed the community's practices to a certain to what extent are they able to do that, how have they added, what dependencies have they added, have they written tests, yes, no, what have they used for the testing. And same thing in if we do say front end or something like that, JavaScript, same deal there, how did you build it, which tools did you use, etc, etc, etc. And that is where that experience thing comes in, because when you have coded for a few years, you will start to recognize that especially if you move about a little bit, which I have, you will see that most companies, if on average, there's this almost sphere of how you usually do things within a code base, and you can almost start to recognize the styles. I've even got I'm not going to say that I always get it right, but I've gotten to the point now where if you are, especially if you're a front-end developer or like a JavaScript person or something like that, if you tell me what your main tool is, I am usually I'm also almost always able to just guess what other tools you are using, because there are certain tooling, depending on what type of development you're doing, that is very associated and very common with a specific type of developer, like an archetype of developer, right? And that is what I use in order to figure out sort of how good the person is. Now, the thing that is very important for me, though, to mention is that evaluating a code test is very difficult, because you have to make some assumptions. Because if you don't make any assumptions or put any restrictions on yourself in your evaluation, then you will have to interview every single candidate. Because I was telling my coworker this yesterday. She and I were agreed there was a code test where this was a front-end thing. They had created a UI thing that wasn't according to the specification, but it was still working. And I had looked at the code and I checked all the things, and overall it looked pretty good. And I said we should probably still fail this person, but I would like to get a second opinion. And she said yes, I think also so, because they haven't followed the spec. And I said, the only thing that gives me hesitation here is that, yes, they have not followed the specification, but the code is good. And here's the problem with that. They have proven that they can write software. They have not proven that they can follow a specification, but that could be a simple misunderstanding. And that is what's so difficult. I mean, shit, you ask me how many times I have misunderstood or not read the specification for a code test properly, and I still got the job because in that code interview, like they were okay with that I had missed some parts about something that they might have not cared so much, and they saw that overall this person could actually code, right? And then I got to go and do the personal interview. In this specific company, it was different, where we basically said that, all right, we need to just say that if you can't produce something that is sort of like, I like to call it a drunk QA test, if I can see very clearly that you haven't checked the specification before you submitted, like because we give them artboard, like they can see exactly what we want them to build, and if you're not able to follow that, okay, then you're out, sorry, because take the time to make sure that things are at least looking the way they're supposed to be looking if you're a front-end developer, right? Because no designer, or for example, no PO or designer would let you do that. You just do your own thing when you have a specification, right? But as I said, it's hard to tell if that was because there was no, it wasn't a bug. It seemed to be something that they had just decided to do. But that also brings us to the other question: did they do that because they felt that it was nicer, or because they felt it was optional, or was it because they solved it or was it because they could only solve their problem that way? That is very difficult to tell, and that's why I always tell people it's almost impossible to tell how good a person is based on just the test. The only time I usually fail, as I said, like I tell people always, just create a base rule. Like you ask all the people who are doing the interviews, what do you value? And then you have to measure that with like sort of what you can expect from the community. I even had a manager who told me that he was surprised that he's very into test-driven development, right? And he said, we should fail all the front-end candidates who are not adding tests to their front-end tests. And I go, then we're going to have to fire half the department. Because so far I've interviewed like 50 or maybe 100 candidates, and only one person wrote unit tests, and I didn't either. So, and he's like, why don't you do that? And I said, because unfortunately in the front end world, unit testing is damn optional for a lot of people in a lot of companies across the world. It's actually rare to find decent front end developers who actually know anything about testing. Some of them do, of course, to varying levels and so forth. So if you want that to be a part of it, you have, as I said, you have to know the community. You have to understand what you are trying to get into your company. And so I told my manager, if you really want to make sure that we have people who know testing and not hire anybody, because you can teach people everything if you just, depending on how you do it, right? Then you have to write that in the code test. I even go as far as to say, write some stub test for a component that is part of the test or something like that, and just say that they fail, and then put an actual part in the description saying, hey, we expect you to write unit test. I did the backend test as well for the specific position, and there I did write unit test. And I told my manager I did write unit test for that part. The reason is because I know that in backend development, when it's like basically, and this test was like all logic, I know that is the expectation, and the other part was that the test was actually so difficult that I had to write unit test because I wanted to make sure that I actually got everything right? So it was important to me, right? So what I want you to take away from this is that the way that I evaluate somebody's code is based on experience working in the community, and that's what I tell people. If you are going to make fair assessments of somebody's code, first and foremost, you have to just accept that it's going to be a flawed thing, because the problem is that if you start saying that if you make exceptions and you try to, because you can always interpret things, and this is the thing that is so damn unfair with the education system. If you have a nice teacher, you might go out there with a really nice grade. If you have a bad teacher, they might give you a really bad grade, and because they are, at the end of the day, the people who are interpreting, like they are making an assessment of your performance, and it's up to their value system. You kind of submit and just pray. Same thing when you do a code review or a code test, and that's why I tell people, don't take it so hard if you don't get the job, because it doesn't necessarily mean that you're bad. Only time you should call yourself a failure. Well, I don't want to ever call yourself a failure, but the only time you should be concerned that something isn't so good with your coding is if you continues to see this all the time. You're never getting any jobs for whatever code test you send in, then there's a problem. But if it's like just every now and then, don't think as much about it, because the test process is flawed as fuck. And for the people who are doing the interviews or doing the evaluation of the code, just always do this thing, as I said. You make sure that you know what common tools are, common practices, common patterns of how to work in that stack, and then put a rule saying that, agree with the other people in the company. Okay, we should make sure that there's always unit tests, or they should make sure that this is here, this is here, this is here, and then put that in the test. Because that's the thing, guys. I know that a lot of people think that the testing process is there to try to fail you, and sometimes it feels like you're trying to that the people in the company are trying to fail you. It's not about trying to fail people. It is about making sure that you're not going to pay someone who doesn't really know their stuff a lot of money, because it's really hard to figure that out actually once they're in the company, if they're good or bad. And it's, in some cases, it's almost impossible to get rid of them once you have them. So you have to make a bit of an upfront investment to make sure that you have someone who's good. And so what I tell people in the companies, just put everything on the specification, even the stuff that you sort of hope that they're going to fill out themselves. Because here's the kicker. If they don't think about it, they might just think that you don't care about it. It doesn't mean that they didn't know how to do it. It's just that they didn't see that there was a reason to do it. And as I said, I did the same thing to my coworker. I didn't write any tests or anything. And I would argue that considering that I lead most of the testing in the company at that, or I did at that company, did most of the tech talks related to testing, and I actually did a webcast on this stuff. I know how to test. It's just that I didn't think about it in the front-end context. I did in the back-end context, and all that they had to do was to write that was part of it. And so that's what I tell people. Do that, and then make sure that you have someone who knows how to work in the sort of environment that you're hiring for to do the evaluation. Have a great day.